Welcome everybody back to the 39 Gen podcast from Yosan University. I've got a really awesome guest with me today. Would you like to tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Sure. My name's Brandt Stickley, and I'm an associate professor in the College of Classical Chinese Medicine at the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon. And I'm a long-term student of the late Dr. Leon Hammer and started studying with him very, very early in my schooling, let alone my career. And he has been probably the most formative influence on my life.
That's
and
awesome.
certainly on my work.
That's really awesome. I've had some people mention Dr. Hammer before, Dr. Leon Hammer, and I would love to actually know what is this technique that he taught. Because as for students of Chinese medicine, they know that the diagnosis can be, you have your questions, you have your tongue diagnosis. There's all these different things, but one of the core areas, and for people who are listening that are not students or practitioners of Chinese medicine, we take the pulse and feel the pulse to check the state of health and wellness of a person's body. What is Dr. Leon Hammer's technique?
So Dr. Hammer's pulse system, which we refer to as the Shen Hammer pulse system, because he learned it from his teacher, Dr. John H.F. Shen, who was from Shanghai. Dr. Hammer's pulse system is a very sophisticated system that was handed down within a lineage, first from scholar physicians from the Menghe region in China, amongst them the Fei family and the Ding family. Dr. Shen was part of some of the early colleges in Shanghai, in the Republican period, some of the early colleges where in Shanghai there was a college that was run by the Ding family. And it's very clear that these pulse models, probably stemming back to Fei Boxiong and through the Menghe Ding lineage and into Dr. Shen's hands, and then from Dr. Shen transmitted to Dr. Hammer, that there are some more sophisticated, more searching, more pressing, so to speak, aspects to how we find the pulse and the positions that we access. So in addition to the common 6 positions, we access another 22 positions that we refer to as the complementary positions. And those are found by rolling the fingers in particular ways. Even some of the principal positions, for example, the distal position in Shen Hammer, rather than placing the finger just flat upon the radial artery, we actually roll under the scaphoid to find it.
Wow.
And there's various techniques within it, and I can explain there's good reason for it. And Dr. Hammer learned that from Dr. Shen in a very traditional kind of master-disciple one-to-one relationship. One of Dr. Hammer's great contributions was to democratize that and to make that available outside of a traditional master-disciple relationship. So he taught many, many people. In addition to that, he also created a nomenclature which is based on sensation.
Interesting.
And one of the things something that I often say is that sensation is the language of awareness. And since sensation is a language of awareness, when we focus on sensation, first of all, we eliminate filters between our direct experience and the direct experience of the sensation in the pulse. Within the pulse, we also find that there are a number of parameters, common parameters, volume, strength, force, width, length, shape. But all of those comprise something that I would refer to as gesture. And gesture is direction expressed through some medium. And
Mm.
so through the medium of the fluid dynamics and the chi dynamics and the energetic dynamics within the pulse, we perceive the sensation. It illustrates a gesture. From the gesture, we get a direction. From the direction, we can then understand organ function, channels, because everything in Chinese medicine, especially in classical Chinese medicine, is a question of time, space, direction, and rhythm and gesture. And
Mhm.
those are my 5 criteria for basically what comprises what how does a classical model differ from more recent, more even pre-modern or more modern models.
That's wild. It's really interesting because it it gives you there's a better diagnostic tool. You have more that you're pulling from. You're not looking at. I imagine that if I, as a photographer,
Yeah.
I have a camera, and imagine that I'm shooting old school. I love film, but let's say I have a film that shoots in 3 colors or just black and white. And I'm working with that, and I want to then use that to diagnose and see, what's happening with a person. Now, diagnose or, looking at is there too much red or not? Well, if I don't have something that measures red, then how can I get a clear picture of what's happening there? So if you have more parameters to judge by, then you can start looking at things in deeper ways. And, at the end of the day, having better outcomes for your patients.
Right. And in that measure, I would say that when we are, the Shen is that which exceeds yin and yang.
Yeah.
And yet it comes into being through the meeting of yin and yang. And from yin and yang, it's from the interaction of yin and yang, it's born. And in other words, it's able to channel. It's able to channel from a kind of universal status into a particular status.
I love that.
And for that reason, I would argue that Shen is almost imperceptible. Shen Ming, on the other hand, is the brightness that it emits when it's moving in a flowing and hindered way.
Yeah.
And so that quality of the Shen expressing itself as the Shen Ming, it can only be understood through the whole. We can only
Mm.
rightly see it as a whole. However, that's not to say that the whole is not made up of innumerable, almost infinite, idiosyncratic even qualities that we can perceive, so that like a pointillist painting, all of that emerges into a greater, almost spherical dimension where we can perceive the whole. And
Yeah.
that means that we're able to see. And when we see in that way, when we see things in terms of a whole, and we see them in a, as I said, kind of spherical, 3-dimensional, all aspects manner, well, time is embedded within that. And in not just present time, but future time, past time, all emerging through that expression of the whole, because the whole has to encompass all of time.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, when we place our finger on the pulse and we place our finger in a stream or a current of time expressing itself through the physical body, then it's so simple to just follow that trail to the event that gave rise to whatever set of symptoms and patterns are coming up now.
Nice.
And then it's all just a question of following that trail, finding that trail, and with the use of the miraculous quality of the needle, we can unwind that quality and allow it to emerge into a completely different expression.
You ever, when you were younger, get a giant ball of yarn that has a knot in it, and somewhere inside that,
More than that, I have probably at least 3 extension cords in the garage that have
there you
that
go.
situation.
They're all knotted up, they're all tied, And as people sit there and they go, what is happening here? How did this ever get this way? But the reality is, if you can find that one point of tightness, and you
right?
are able to loosen that knot, suddenly you've got an extension cord that unwinds and works again, you know?
Exactly. And the fact is, every single one of those, every single strand in that skein of yarn is expressing, in a sense, a different, could be expressing a different quality of time. So
Yeah,
part of my understanding is that when we speak about the channels, we should be truly speaking about time and its intersection with the physical. And that each one of the channels and every aspect of chi is actually an expression of time in a
I
way
love it.
that's elucidated by Liu Li Hong very eloquently in his book, his book, Contemplating Chinese Medicine, that's been translated as Classical Chinese Medicine.
That's
And
amazing.
he explains how qi and the lungs governing of qi is actually governing expressions of time.
Oh,
And
wow.
that's why when we learn Chinese medicine, we learn the lung channel first, because we're starting from that origin point.
Talking about time, talking about yin and yang being a reflection of the whole, just has me thinking to something I've been seeing everyone sharing, and I think you might have shared it as well. That's been going around. I've been seeing so many of my friends share this that are in acupuncture on Facebook, that they just imaged quantum entanglement. And what was interesting is, like, they have this imaging of these two entangled electrons, I believe, and it's literally forming the shape of the yin yang. And it's just like,
Uh-huh.
and the scientists are like, well, we didn't necessarily expect that.
Those observations are bound to happen. The fact is, you know, the capacity to, frankly, one of the most amazing things about Western science is its capacity to observe, its
Yeah,
capacity to perceive, and especially as it happens, privileging the visual, right? But the
yeah,
you know, John Berger would tell you. So like that's amazing. And when it comes to practice, it's like I literally don't discourage patients from getting Western imaging under almost any circumstances, because the more we know, the more we see, and then the understanding of how the dynamics, the triggers, and the ways that those develop, the kind of like incipient quality within things,
yeah,
which is those are two. The trigger is G, and incipient is also G. So this quality of incipience and something that's just about to emerge, just about to emerge from the state of empty plenipotentiality,
yeah,
we can perceive that. Like we can perceive that. And we know that it's only rightly, truly inner vision that's actually capable of seeing that. Now outer vision is kind of like coming in line to perceive the contours of it. But we can perceive the dynamic within it.
I love that. Can you talk to me a little bit about, you have this really beautiful synthesis. You have your background in Shin hammer pulse diagnosis, but you've also studied classical acupuncture and classical Han and Tang Dynasty herbal medicine. What drove you to go deeper after you finished your degree? What was
Well,
the
so
catalyst?
so everything I do stems from what I've described, which is the capacity to feel and to perceive directly through feeling. And there came a time, and now I was very lucky. My first week in acupuncture school, I read Dr. Hammer's book, Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies. And I opened that book and I realized that it was my life's work unfolding in those pages. A
Wow.
kind of, and the fact is, not many people recognize this, but that book, Dr. Hammer's book, Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies, one of the keys to understanding that book is that it's what we would call a Bildungsroman. It's a book, it's a narrative in a sense, a narrative unfolds of the evolution of a person.
Interesting.
And the evolution of Dr. Hammer in that book is from a materialist scientist into a Chinese medicine, a person who I would argue has intuited many of the truths espoused in the Neijing through his own kind of process of spiritual reasoning.
I love that.
Um, and so there was a time when Dr. Hammer said, towards the end of his life, Dr. Hammer said, you know, Brandt's trying to convince me that everything I've ever said is in the Shanghan Lun. And he wasn't completely right, but he wasn't wrong either, because the fact is that when we seek principles, when we strive to understand principles, we can find those principles expressed within classical texts, because classical texts are built upon principle. They're built upon understanding principle. And so the work that I did studying Dr. Hammer's work and then studying the pulse and learning how to be present fully to feel what's happening in someone's pulse illustrated to me that I needed to look to classical models that were not materialistic, that were not positivist, that were not what I call horizontal examples of horizontal encyclopedism, but were based in direct knowledge, direct perception, and the direct reading of source texts. And what I found is, in the qi dynamic model of the Shanghan Lun, I found a system which was rooted in physicality, rooted in blood, rooted in body fluids, rooted in tissue, and yet not limited to that within a circumscribed circle, but opens as a spiral into the cosmos, and that the 6 conformations, as we refer to them, speak as much of the inner nature and the outer nature and the nature of the cosmos itself, and not only the nature of the cosmos, the genesis of the cosmos.
I love that. No, man, you're speaking to me. You're speaking to me because it's like one of the things too, and coming back to the synthesis of classical and modern, and then as Western comes into, you're spot on. Anything we can do to help our patients. So if you have imaging, use it. But there is this beauty in. I had my own health challenges years ago, and it was interesting because I went to all these different people, and Western, Eastern, and people were baffled. But then what I was describing. Finally, one day I went to an acupuncturist. I had her actually on the podcast, and she trained extensively in the Shanghan Lun. And I was describing things. She's like, "That's Shanghan Lun, man." And she was like, "Let's try to bring back some of these older principles," and brought me back to health. And it was so powerful because as I started reading the Shanghan Lun, I was like, wow, this makes sense to me, and on
Right.
so many levels.
Well, what people need to understand about the Shanghan Lun is, and the Jingui also, but what people need to understand about it is that, well, first of all, it's gestural, it's directional, and it's phenomenological. And that means that when you read a line of the Shanghan Lun, you're reading a description of something as it is. And right, the phenomenology is the study of things as they are. And so that's what you're getting with every single line that describes a set of symptoms and a pattern. You're getting ultimately a pattern that someone has experienced, that someone
Yeah.
has physically experienced in their body.
Mm-hmm.
And that we can read those. And if we start to read the lines and we read them through this lens, which in my view, and there's, of course, this is just my view. It's like there's many, many perspectives on the Shanghan Lun, and they're all worthy, and I honor all of those approaches. But to my mind, it's like we see this directionality of yin and yang. There's cold and there's wind, right? I'm
Yeah.
very fond of saying, there's only one pathology in all of Chinese medicine, and that's going against the numinous, and
Talk to
that's
me about that.
going against the way of heaven.
Okay.
And so sometimes the way of heaven, sometimes the Tao is reverting, you know? So it's not to say that that goes in a linear manner either.
Hmm.
But I lost my train of thought.
I've been there. Well,
Yeah.
the Tao was reverting at that moment,
What,
man.
what was I saying? Oh, there's only one pathology in Chinese medicine. And when you look at those lines through yin and yang, and you start to see that every single symptom is an expression of yin and yang, it's an expression of the internal quality and the terrain coming into contact with a stressor, which can
Yeah.
be excitatory or inhibitory, right? Wind is excitatory and yang, and cold is inhibitory and yin. And so that's the ways in which things can be inhibited. They can move too fast, they can move too slow, they can not move at all, they can be
Mm.
enclosed, or they can be overflowing. And
Yeah.
those are all directions. And so when we see yin and yang, instead of seeing it as if it were some sort of proto substance, but
Yeah.
instead we see it as a dynamic process, which is itself the breath of the cosmos, expanding and contracting as all things do, then we're perceiving these actions directly. And what the Shanghan records is when those movements, those qualities of movement are happening in a particular way and in a particular milieu within the physical body. So each of the 6 conformations describes a different aspect of the body, but everything's everything all of the time. All of them are functioning simultaneously, right? Your Taiyang is interacting with the environment. Your Shaoyang is promoting metabolism through ministerial fire. Your body, the physicality of your body itself, is the quality of Tai Yin.
So amazing.
And the earth, and it's not a metaphor, right? Like the fact that our body is of the earth is not a metaphor.
Hmm.
And we can then become so acquainted with different expressions through a coherent body of texts that includes medical texts, philosophical texts, historical texts, poetry texts. And if we gain fluency, some fluidity at least, or fluency or proficiency with the contents of those different texts, all of which were coherent and were being read by a very limited number of people,
Hmm.
in fact, so that they all understood the connections between all of the different texts, that they were able to be terse in a way because it was understood that underlying it was this kind of like dynamic process, and that dynamic process is what is we call life,
Yeah.
right? It's life. And that life
100%.
is the unfolding of yang in a milieu of yin. And
That's
so
awesome.
all we're trying to do is observe. All we're trying to do is observe the activity of that yang and the state of that yang within its expression through the various physicalities and dynamics of our organs and channels.
That's right. What are your favorite classical books? What are the texts that you go,
Well,
these
so
are
100%, 100%. Well, so of course, right? The shot. So all herbal medicine, all Chinese herbal medicine is a footnote to the Shanghanlun. I will say that unequivocally. And so, obviously, the Shanghanlun and the Jingui, these are my favorite herbal texts. However, when people say to me, I'm interested in going to Chinese medicine school, what book should I read to prepare myself for
hmm.
that? I say to them, you must read the Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is
Yeah.
absolutely, unequivocally my favorite book, my favorite classical text. Zhuangzi is my favorite classical text. There's no question about it. And everything about the Zhuangzi delights me. Its humor, its depth, its manner of speaking, what it illustrates, the principles that it describes, these are all so dear to me. And amongst them, right, you will find that the Zhuangzi is the world's first anti-psychiatry textbook. It is the first kind of like non-pathologizing perspective. It describes a completely non-pathologizing perspective, which informs every interaction that I have with every single patient that I work with. And as it happens, that non-pathologizing perspective is also that which is espoused in Dr. Hammer's work. Dr. Hammer created this system, which is an avenue for a completely non-pathologizing approach to mental health, and a non-punitive approach, and a non-hierarchical approach.
That's all. Dr. Hammer had his own approach to medical psychiatry, correct?
Right. That his book, The Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies, is his perspective as a psychiatrist on what he discovered, the principles that he discovered in Chinese medicine that allowed him to break out of the confines of a Western medical framework and begin to perceive his patients as truly individuals, and individuals that are expressions of the whole.
I love that. There are so many great concepts, philosophical concepts that you've mentioned, but like I want to dive into that a little bit more. If you had a couple of favorite concepts that people should really, I want to go deeper in this medicine. What are some concepts, some philosophical concepts that people should look at more?
Well, so the single most important one, the one that is most dear and most important to me, is the one that I just was mentioning, and that is to seek a non-dual, non-pathologizing approach to medicine.
What is a non-pathologizing approach for someone who doesn't understand that?
Well, so one iteration of that comes from one of the great turns of phrase of Dr. Hammer is that we recognize that symptoms, and that includes physical symptoms, and that includes behaviors, and that includes personality traits, are attempts, always represent an attempt of the body to continue to grow and to continue to live. And that we can recognize and we can perceive the innate aliveness within that behavior or that symptom. And we can recognize that it may be a maladaptive response to some stimuli, but it's always a means for what is essential in a person to make contact, to stay intact. So the phrase from Dr. Hammer's book is contact to stay intact.
I like that.
Now, today, a student on I was supervising a shift, and today the student said, contact to stay in. We were talking about a patient who's somewhat demanding, and the student said to me, I just go into it taking that phrase, contact to stay intact, and it changes how I interact with them.
That's awesome. The interesting thing too is that you're talking to me about this whole person, this whole approach, of seeing everything in a larger lens. It seems like,
right.
And one of the things that's always struck me in mental health is that I've in the past suffered from depression, and depression was this outside thing. Here's depression over here. It is outside. It is abnormal. It is this. And like, there's like, it's almost like it's this big monster that stands in the corner. And
Right.
yet,
But that was ego syntonic for you.
yep,
That was helpful for you to perceive it in that way for some period of time until it no longer needed to alert you to what needed to change in your life.
totally.
Right. And that depression was trying to alert, was your body's way of saying, I need to stop this pushing. I need to stop this striving. I need to stop this efforting and be internal and perceive what my life wants to unfold in how my life wants to unfold in a different direction. Now, for a time being, when we've come into the world in a way where, when we've come into a world such as the majority of our patients have, where it is governed by principles of capitalism and oppression and exploitation, colonialism and imperialism, we, access to that inner world is more challenged because the energy of those qualities is all towards objectification, reification, commodification, and outwardness.
Yeah,
And rather than being afforded the respect that we deserve for our being,
yeah,
we feel that we must produce or act in a way that we are earning respect or earning our sense of worth from what we do.
yeah.
And that means that one who is looking to do is always looking outside of themselves for something to do.
100%. And even more in this time of seeking external validation. I was driving with my wife last night, and I've worked in social media a long time, but I'm blown away by the rapid shifts in media. And we were driving home in a taxi, and I saw people lined up on this street doing dances.
Mm.
Like, just,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, I'm not hating on it. It was not, but yet what was interesting to me is like, I grew up evaluating myself through this lens, the lens of you are perceived higher because you have an education. You are perceived higher because you have this. And it's all just lenses. It's all these
Right.
different types of lenses instead of, I remember once, I had this practitioner that started this session, and it wasn't even an acupuncture session. It was an acting technique, the Alexander technique. And my
Oh.
friend did this session for me, and he stopped and he was helping me to center a breath, and he kept telling me, "You have time, and just take a breath into that." And then suddenly he looked at me and he said, "I see you." And I was just like, oh, it was just this, in this moment, there was no, Sean, you are being rated by your level of education, your amount of money, by your ability to dance. And that's why I got into the social media thing, is that now we have this new framework for the people. How good of a dancer are you? And I'm a horrible dancer. I hope that doesn't catch on so much, because
Well,
I'm
so
really,
on the other hand, right? Like, on the other hand, we could also see that as this ebullient nature of dance emerging, right? Like
100%, right?
Emma Goldman said, if there's no dancing in the revolution, it's not my revolution,
Hell yeah.
right? And
Hell yeah.
so to see that, like, to see that and for that to be, listen, I'm not against commerce.
Right.
I'm against capitalism. I'm anti-capitalist, but I'm not anti-commerce, right? I'm like, plenty of money in your pocket, none in your hearts. That's the way. And the fact is, commerce is a very natural kind of energetic exchange that's really important. And so the ability to generate income from your dancing by streaming it on something, more power to you.
Right.
Like, let's go.
I want to ask you about this. Yeah, and I love that. Um, Again, coming back to there was something that I'd seen in your bio that was really popped out to me, and it was about talking about process oriented philosophy and healing. What is a process oriented philosophy? Because I have an idea of what it means, and saw that and I was like, ooh, I like that. But I want to
Mhm.
ask you, what is a process oriented healing?
Well, so technically that term relates to Alfred North Whitehead as the process philosophy, but I'm using it in a little bit of a broader sense, which is really about that we strive to see that we strive to see things as process. We strive to see things as constantly emerging from emptiness, and that we're always striving to perceive how everything is unfolding rather than focusing on things, substances, right? Like, so the fact is, everything materializes, but not everything is a thing, right?
Yeah.
So process comes into shape, and it it territorializes as something to go into a kind of Gilles Deleuzian model. It it comes into shape, and it territorializes as something, and then the needle comes into contact. The needle comes into contact with that terroir, and it is immediately re-territorialized into this new thing. And now there's an avenue, a line of flight, a nomadic line of flight, which can allow this pattern to then unfold in a completely different way.
That's right.
And so I'm saying, try to understand that yin and yang are are a process, not substances, not things, not measurable things. They're a process. So, that when we sweat, that means sweating. When you read sweating, it means that there's been this outward movement of yang energy. How do you
Hmm.
sweat? You push yang energy out. That's what sweat is. And the loss of that sweat is more significantly a loss of yang energy and capacity than it is substance and fluid. And so we then understand that when you read, oh, this person sweated too much, that could mean they went to the gym too much. That could mean they worked at their too many hours at their work. That all those things are ways in which we are expending the yang.
Yeah.
And that's and it's all processed.
Yeah. That's right.
And so another aspect of that, I would argue, is that when we see that in that manner, we see more profoundly the relationships between things. So I'm suggesting that, like, it's not that we are seeing yin and yang. We're looking outside and seeing yin and yang. It's that we're seeing through the lens of yin and yang. That our eyes themselves are perceiving as yin and yang.
I love
And
that.
so then that's a very different situation, because then we're seeing how everything like emerges. And that means we have to be able to go into the sort of stillness and
Yeah.
find that stillness, and then bring that stillness into contact with activity, and then have a witness that's also capable of perceiving those things.
I love that. What is your vision for integrative medicine? Where do you see? How do we synthesize this beautiful esoteric with the reality that our patients exist in modern healthcare? How can we synthesize this, and where should we be going?
I think that the paradox for me is that when I it seems to me that when I read, first of all, I think that Western medicine's an excellent metaphor. Western medicine works very well as a metaphor,
Hmm.
and Chinese medicine, it seems to me, expresses reality much more closely. And that reality has to include anatomical and physiological observable phenomena as much
Yeah.
as it includes the unseen.
Yeah.
And I think that a classical model is a particularly that the classical texts are particularly well suited to that perception of both seen and unseen simultaneously, and the capacity to perceive the relationship between them. So if we find that phenomenological direct perception of the relationship between things, then integrative medicine emerging from that lens that doesn't privilege one particular framework over another
Yeah.
is potentially rich, a very potentially rich avenue
I love that.
for
Y-
alleviating suffering.
You've served as a visiting professor at Yosan. Will you be doing any more lectures there in the coming in the near future?
Presumably, yes. I
Hope
I
so.
I, I enjoy I enjoy I enjoy working at Yosan and interacting with the students and the faculty there. And of course, the great Rob Hoffman is
Yeah.
always out any opportunity to hang out with Rob Hoffman, I will take at a
You
drop
and
of a
me,
hat.
you and me both, brother. You and me
Yeah.
both.
Um,
Um, what about? There was one last thing. If you have a couple seconds more, I what is Chinese magical medicine?
okay. Well, so my answer to that now is a little bit different than it would have been when I first coined that term. But um, there's this there's this great book. Well, there's a great book called Chinese Magical Medicine, for one thing, and there's also a book, Early Chinese Medicine, which are the Ma Wang Dui texts,
Yeah.
and um, the so for me, right? So we could ask ourselves, what's magic? Magic is harnessing the power of the unseen to influence, or harnessing the power of the subtle to influence the dense.
Mm,
Right? Magic is harnessing the power of the subtle to rule the dense. And that means that if that's a definition of magic, then Chinese medicine, all of Chinese medicine is magic in a certain way,
yeah.
because it's using subtle influences to interact with dense substance. Now, for me, that means also that we have to develop the capacity and proficiency to perceive those subtle influences right up and through aspects that are for most people unseen,
Yeah.
spirits, ghosts, and the like. And that ultimately, I would say, in a sense, going back to the process oriented model and the phenomenological model, that another term for that whole, and the relational ontology, is another term for that is animism.
Mm,
And that is, the perception of life in things, the aliveness of things, and the inspirited quality and the enchanted quality of things. And so that includes what we would now term synchronicities. That
yeah.
includes the influence of number and direction and taste, even. All of
Yeah.
these are subtle influences that have very profound effects on physical matter. And so, you know, employing magic means that we're trying to improve the probability of the outcome that is the best, that which alleviates the greatest amount of suffering and unleashes the greatest amount of freedom and joy,
I love
and
that.
freedom from compulsion from forces outside of one, and freedom from compulsion from forces arising within one. And so I urge people, load the dice,
Yeah.
load the dice, mark the deck, and harness the power of awareness, and harness the power of the subtle to create the influence that you want, that is wanted, the influence that is necessary. Add nothing to it, but connect to it with elegance and nobility and grace and power. That's magical medicine. Nowadays, I think that refers to talismans and spiritual cultivation and heavenly medicine, as it's known, Juyo, which I have been studying through my association with Parting Clouds,
That's
Taoist
awesome.
education, as as are, I think, many of your guests.
I think so. I think they are kind of leading the way right now, which is awesome.
It is the most incredible. It is the most incredible education and religious organization I have encountered. It is authentic. It is rooted, grounded. It is firmly within lineage, and the depth of the teaching in Parting Clouds Taoist education is without measure. Nothing compares.